Welcome to Psych Health and Safety in Canada. And today I'm thrilled to welcome an old friend, Kerri Brock. Kerri and I were just talking before we started this that it's been years, like it has been for so many people, that it was pre-pandemic that we were together. So welcome, Kerri. And I want to start with you letting people know how you came to be involved or even understand the concept of psych health and safety.
Thanks, Marianne. It's really great to see you again and to be here. I've been wondering, in preparation for the podcast, like how did I come to this idea of psychological health and safety? And I guess there's two paths. I think like so many of us, we learn about these skills through some of our own personal and lived experiences. And then, my career took me on this interesting journey around human behavior and started with social marketing, in kind of the healthcare space. And then that took me into organizational change and then introduced me to coaching, which then introduced me to positive psychology. And through the narrative method, I think that's really where I first learned about this idea of psychological capital. But through that, then that journey really took me down into the positive psychology networks, which is where I had the opportunity to meet you. And then how it shows up, particularly knowing the work that you and a team of people have done around the standards is coming to see it, how it plays out in workplaces and in my coaching practice with people. So that's kind of the journey that brought me to this wonderful world of psychological safety.
So I think, Kerri, that my experience was similar. I went from the individual experience of a person in a workplace to the impact of the workplace. And the impact the workplace can have on individuals. So starting with the micro and going to the macro. But you mentioned positive psychology, and we haven't talked about it much on this program. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit with our listeners about what's the difference between psychology and positive psychology.
Okay, so if I think about when people ask me about this idea of positive psychology, and through the great teachings and learnings that I've done in the network, certainly humans are a very complex and diverse set of skills and characteristics. And so when I talk about positive psychology, it really is that scientific approach to human performance, the optimal functioning of an individual, and then recognizing, right, that holistic component of individuals that we look at the spectrum from the flourishing side, but we also recognize that there's languishing and other indicators of how a human can feel and think and behave. So when I think about positive psychology, that really is that study of the optimal human functioning for individuals and their flourishing.
So flourishing and optimal functioning, I think most people get that. That means that we're at our best, we're feeling great, we're able to function at our highest level. But let's talk and explain what languishing is. Is that a mental illness?
I think from my experience and from how I see that show up, I'm not sure that I would put it as a mental illness, but it's a state of experience and being that we experience and that we can move in and out of, right, through our activities and our behaviors and our mindset. So I'd say languishing is not a mental illness as related to the DSM, but more of a state that we can experience when our life becomes perhaps maybe overwhelming, or adversity is kind of stacked on us. That it can be a heavy load that we're carrying when we're languishing.
Yeah, so that's the lower energy instead of the optimal energy. And all of us get there from time to time. And the idea isn't to avoid it altogether, but to know how to come back out of it, right? And be
Exactly.
able to really, not to quote Oprah, but to live our best lives
Yeah,
is
yeah,
what we want to
exactly.
do. We want to be
Yeah,
able to do. And so many of the tenets of positive psychology, things like having gratitude, things like being able to have resilience, being able to, have growth from difficult situations, are the things that allow us to make the best out of the lives that we have.
yeah.
Kerri, you years ago when we were talking, you talked about the unpacking your hero. Can
Yes.
you share a bit about what that is?
Sure. So the Unpack Your Hero, concept, kind of put my marketing hat on after reading all of a lot of research around positive psychology and really looking at psychological capital, which is that kind of psychological development of an individual that's characterized by hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism. And so that's where the hero component came from. And often, if we think about the workshop, is really built around that idea that we each have protective factors built into our mindsets or that we have the ability to learn those skills, but then to also have an opportunity to sit and reflect on what are some of those positive or protective factors that we have in our life. And we look at the PERMA V model, which is the framework of positive psychology. And I use some interactive ways to bring people from the idea into their bodies. That's a big part of what I like to do in the work. But the hero element is really to help people identify that they have this component, this wiring that allows for them to look at where hope and their confidence and their resilience and their optimism can play a part in moving them forward toward their goals and allowing them to grow. And that growth is also experienced when we think about our negative emotions, right? And often we want to step back for them or push them down or not really allow ourselves to experience it. But the workshop allows people to really get into their bodies and understand that sensation that they're feeling, both from their positive affect, but also from the negative emotions, so that they can, as I like to say, kind of compost those negative emotions and turn them into fertilizer for growth, and take that message from that emotion and really listen to it and understand what is the lesson from this emotion. Where's the contrast from what I'm trying to get to? And then reframes are not just as simple as going, oh, now I'm going to think a new way, but it is being able to sit in that emotion so that you can process it and release it. So
Yes,
that's
there's
really
so
the
much
essence.
wisdom in what we call negative emotions. And
Yeah.
the longer we refuse to listen, the harder the lesson gets. Whereas if we just think, well, why am I always so angry? Or why am I so frustrated? Why am I so sad? And we actually delve into what is that? What does that feel like in my body? Is a great place to start, because that allows us not to try to rationalize what it is, but to feel it. Now, you mentioned PERMA V. Are
Yes.
you able to share with people what PERMA V means?
Yeah, sure. So that the PERMA-V is the model of positive psychology, and for if I just break it down, P is for the positive emotions and effects. So that's our brain biases and in our sphere of emotions. E is on the is engagement. It's been a while since I've gone through the model. E is the engagement element, and that's really where we look at being connected in flow. R is for relationships. And so again, I'm high extrovert, so I tend to spend a lot of time in that relationship piece, building high quality connections, kind of understanding people in my network and really belonging is such a big part of those relationships. And I think such a huge component of that psychological safety. How do I feel in myself, but also how do I feel in group and in relationship with others. I want to do one thread here because a philosophy that I picked up during my early time in social marketing was Ubuntu, and it's a South African philosophy that means I am because you are. So when I am well, you are well, and when you are well, I am well. And I know that's a large order to ask for, but I really believe that this becomes a big part of as I feel whole and connected to self, then I can connect with others. And that community piece is so important to survival and to health and well-being. We're seeing such great work in social prescribing. And then I'll come back to the model. So our relationships, if I was going to promote any one, they're all very important, but R is my go-to. And then of course, M for PERMA, the meaning. So this is where transcendence and awe and wonder. I play around on Wednesdays with Wonder-Filled Wednesday and see if we can't get people thinking about that in alignment with their goals. And then A, so that achievement, this is where goal setting and goal meeting, and certainly the elements of self-determination and will and discipline. And then the V piece, the vitality. So that's that mind-body connection again. So relationships and the V piece, V for PERMA V on the vitality. So the mind-body connection and how we look after our mental health and our physical health, and that interconnected, which I think is so important. And we often don't think about that in our health.
Thank you so much for that, Kerri. I think that's, when you describe each of those components, you really, pardon me, you really see how they contribute to a good life. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about why you focus on the body and how you do that.
Okay. So the why, I focus on the body. Again, a little bit of it is from my own personal experience in how kind of the somatic has shown up. And then and then as I got more into, we'll call it the learning and looking at the integration of body wisdom, the brain and the spinal cord, right, are connected. And from there, it takes us out to all, 12 nerves that basically run the body. So our senses and the wisdom that comes from the body is really just as important as anything that's happening in our cognitive, and they do work in concert. It's not about one over the other. It's about the integration of both that I think allows for a deeper knowing, but more being. And then from there, our ability to process stimuli and information that's coming in, regulate, right? So that we're not, I guess, constantly reactive or in that emotional high state, that we can spike and we can endure stress, but then we can come back to stasis. So when we bring those two really powerful body systems together, I often joke with clients, or not joke with clients, but challenge clients to say, imagine you could be your own observer. Because when I'm in my body, I know more about what's going on with me, but then I also know more about what's going on with the room or other, right? That's that Ubuntu, that connection piece. How do you ask, how do I do that? I think there's a few ways. I'm a big advocate of play or playfulness. So often there's a tchotchke or an activity that we'll do. The three main ones, I think, really using stress balls and with intention. So not just stretching them, but again, bringing the mind and the body together and experiencing the feeling of what it means or what it feels like to know that you have these protective factors, and where do you feel them in our body. I think we start to get really connected with our negative emotions, but often don't understand how our positive emotions feel as well. So stress balls, bean bags is another activity I get people to do when they're stuck, let's say, on a particular experience that they had and they want to work through it. So we'll identify what the stuck is, and then we'll ask them to find it in their body. And then I'll use these bean bags, so they literally hold their hands out for about a minute just to kind of feel the weight and bring that connection of what the weight is that they're holding on to. And then we just talk through. It's usually a talk experience or walking. I love to do walking meetings, but there's usually those moments where we're working through where that energy is and understanding what it feels, so that they're building the muscle around when they feel it, they know what's coming up, and they have a better opportunity to navigate it. Because I don't think it's about managing, it's about, oh, this is coming up, and to let it come up in a way that is healthy for them. So those are a couple of ways. Happy
That's
to share
great,
more.
Kerri. You're reminding me about, and I'm not a biologist or an anatomist, but that the brain cells, very similar cells, are also in the heart and the gut. And so when, for centuries, people have said, I feel it in my heart, or I feel it in my gut. My heart knows, that they're not wrong. That is definitely part of the body where knowledge can be, where those emotions can be. And so getting in touch with our bodies can do that. Now let's flip this to, because this is a lot about self-discovery, self-awareness, which I think is critical to the quality of life. The more self-aware we become, the more we are able to manage life in the way we want. But how does this translate to a workplace?
The idea of psychological safety in the workplace.
The idea of self-awareness, mind-body connection.
Yeah. So I think in the workplace, it certainly is an important factor. It's often one that I think is very hard to adapt to, because we do have so many beautiful cultural norms, right, that we want to work within. But in the workplace, I think there's two ways that this can show up, and it can be just as we're all in our spaces, our cubicles, right, and we're all sensing beings, right, so we're picking up on what other people are saying, we're picking up on how other people are interacting or not, and that can bring an unknowing or an uncertainty, right? And we often don't want to probe, right? You sense something is off, but we won't necessarily act. So often we'll take it up and go, must be me. So, or I don't want to interfere. And so that can create tension, maybe even a bit of anxiety, and then there's some ruminating that will go on, and so everybody's feeling it, but no one's really expressing it. I think expression is one of the universal human needs, and in the workplace, that's often what we feel comfortable to do. I think workplaces are really trying to encourage and promote that. How we do that, I think, is a skill that we're going to continue to refine and do, to talk about being vulnerable in our emotions and what's going on. And then in teams, in some of the social innovation or social impact work, there's this idea around tap the wisdom in the room. And so in order to do that, again, I feel like the mind-body connection, sensing what's going on, sensing what's not being said, holding the space, right, for the quiet, which I think so many of us are not comfortable with, but holding the space for quiet so that everything can emerge, and almost I think as a facilitator, that sensing is one of the skill sets that I rely on the most when there's silence, is to just allow for it to happen first off, to give the group permission. And then the second one is to allow for it to tell us what needs to happen next. So there's this beautiful energy that comes in a room when there's silence, and it kind of it guides you to what needs to happen next, or how to encourage someone to share what's going on. I think that's a big part of the creative process, of the feeling like you're being heard. So often we're in sessions and we're saying things, but we don't necessarily feel heard. And so to let the body wisdom, I guess, again, direct how we tap into that wisdom and sense that there's something that needs to be said, and find a way to meet it, and draw it out through questioning or compassion or just curiosity. I find often is a way to open up some space for those who are otherwise maybe quiet.
Mm-hmm. So what's your advice to the leader who feels very uncomfortable with that client? They ask a question, there's no answer, and they just want to fill that space.
So I think there's a couple of things, and it goes back to when there's a pause. Some people say 5 seconds, some people say 10, whatever that time frame is. I think the almost the longer the better. Having started my career in advertising, you can get a lot into 15 seconds. So I say, like, hold the space for that 10 to 15 seconds. And I think at some point someone does need to intervene and insert and maybe invoke, but through questioning versus statementing. So asking questions, maybe not specifically to an individual, but to the group. And then if I even back it up at the beginning, how we set things up, right, is also really important. So at the beginning, let the group know that should we hit a pause, or should we get quiet, that's going to be okay, that's perfect, but that I will then start asking questions. And I think to be vulnerable too at the beginning. There was a great infographic, I'm pretty sure it was Amy Edmondson. It's like that the leader can say, I know we're going to make mistakes here. How can we get ahead of them? Or what mistakes do you imagine? Like, start asking the questions that get people feeling comfortable to talk about what we naturally perceive as things we don't want to talk about, mistakes or failure or unknowing. So to get the leader to set that tone, but then also when it is quiet, instead of statementing and sharing their wisdom, which they do have, is to ask questions to bring out the wisdom, and then intervene after the group has been exhausted.
Yeah, really, it's like you say, setting the stage first to say this is what we're going to do, and if we struggle, we'll give space. There's also, Kerri, how we hold space. That term won't be familiar to everybody. Tell us a little bit about how you can, what we say is, hold safe space for people to think about their answers.
Yeah. Well, I think the energy is a big piece, right? So, modeling that behavior, demonstrating stillness, a calm demeanor. I think really priming it to let everybody know it's okay that we're quiet right now, or that you're thinking, and we're just going to give each other the time to think about it. But I think the body energy, and also just that instruction to say this is what's going to happen, so everybody starts to feel more comfortable with that. But I think the leader's energy and how they sit in their own silence models that behavior, so that others also can pick up on it.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Now, as people return to whatever the new normal is, how are you helping employers to think about creating a safe space when we know that many people are still anxious? The pandemic's not really over. There's still concerns. What's your advice?
I think the most common pieces, again, come back to how do you meet people where they are? I feel like this massive, I know we're hearing the great resignation and the great shift, but we're kind of having a return to work en masse that we haven't ever really dealt with, at least in my working experience. Yes, I know the idea of return to work and accommodation happens, but it's typically in smaller one-off. And so this is to scale. I'm so impressed with what I am seeing people do. So again, that meeting people where they are understanding what it is they're feeling, what's their sentiment, how are they impacted, and then where we can enable and activate the managers in order to, because the management is really the person who's going to work with them, but how do we support them with some of those tools and strategies that they can employ, right, without in an autonomous way. And so some activities that I'll coach managers that I've worked with is go to where they are, understand what's important to them. I'm a big advocate of what I'll call social prescribing, right? So getting people to pick up a violin that maybe they haven't picked up in a while, or to go to a new park that they might, right? So trying to activate some activity that the individual gets some joy out of, right? And I've often joked where it's like, wouldn't it be great if managers had like a prescription pad that says, I'm prescribing you 2 days in the woods, or a day at a music concert, like depending on what that individual, and I know it's hard to get to what everybody's needs are. And then yet that is where it's messy sometimes, but it's also, that's where the gold is, right? This is where those kind of in the moment interventions can happen. So everybody is readied to be able to meet that person where they need. I think the other piece is, I don't know, I heard this, but it's, go slow, have a good pace with it, right? And yes, I think so many people do want to get back to what they're accustomed to, being in their workplaces, being with their colleagues and their peers. But manage the pace and adjust, again, according to what you're hearing. So frequent touch points, not only from a leadership level, but on the ground, what are we seeing, hearing, and then adjust and adapt from there. So those are kind of two bigger pieces. And then, underneath it, it's, wherever we can, let's bring a little playfulness to this. Not play to be silly, but where is the playfulness about coming back together, being in community? I think there's a great opportunity to almost create some new cultural traditions and some norms that will start to emerge in this hybrid workspace. So what are those that can be then communicated out? And then, like all things, stay steady in yourself in the storm, because the storm has been a long one to endure. And when we can stay steady in the center of the storm, then I think we can rise above and see from a higher vantage point, which allows for meeting people where they are. So
yeah, that's great. I think a lot about what you're talking about, that we're used to a graduated return to work where you get a plan for a person, thinking about where they're at and what they need, how they should be accommodated, and how you ramp up their integration with others, you ramp up their training, their refreshers, so that they can come back to work, especially if they've been off a year. And now this is every person in some workplaces, right? Everybody. And we could say, well, they never left work, they're working from home, but it's like starting a new position, right? It is thinking about the environment and the processes all over again. So it will be interesting. Kerri, when you think about some of the stressors that people will be experiencing through this process, what are they? And obviously through this individual where you're at, we can address them, but just to help people be aware of what might be going on for different people.
I think about this actually quite a bit, and it comes up in so many conversations, particularly in the last 6 months. I joked when we were first talking that COVID introduced me to my inner introvert. And that shift for me, well, one, I didn't know was possible, in that there was one, and two, I quite like her. And so I get curious a little bit around, we've all been out of community for 2 years. And being in community is such a beautiful ritual and a beautiful experience, but it's also very challenging as well, right? Because depending on what the dynamic is and how we show up, right? So to be isolated and kind of independent and autonomous for so long. Yes, I know there's family and connections, but just in the grand, I'm thinking about returning to work, commuter trains, Union Station, right? How are we going to be with each other in the first 3 days, the first 3 weeks, and the first 3 months? Because I think those are some interesting transition points for people just on the commute. Now we're all back together. We've had the luxury of space in some ways. And so I think that is going to be an unconscious thing. We won't know until we bump up against it, right? That, oh, now I'm back in my commuter mode. And that's usually a very high stress mode, a very competitive mode to be in. We're all vying for space. And so I think people are anxious about that. I think the second thing is, and I'm speaking from my own personal experience with COVID, but I have heard this, is that I now see the world in a much more cellular level. Like I think about things on a more, I used to, but now even more so, right? Like this little 0.14 micron has kind of gotten into the world and created havoc. And so I think about things much more nano, and not that that's always healthy. I try to keep a healthy balance of it, but it does bring in anxiety around safety in community, right? So coming back to say, and it's like, oh, they could have that virus, but they could also, right? So I'm trying not to overthink it, but I feel like that is a narrative, a mindset. It's just like, okay, now us as community members are also transmitters of something that can make me unwell. So that's another coming back to community piece. And then I think the third piece, that when we think about kind of coming back to work, it is again about sharing space. I'm sharing printers, I'm sharing kitchens, I'm sharing cubicles, right? I'm sharing emotions, and as well as, just potentially sickness. And I think that COVID has heightened an anxiety around just being unwell and having a cold or the flu, and it takes on, right, like I don't want to say it's paranoia, but I think there's a heightened anxiety around those traditional symptoms that we would just think was a cold or the flu, but now we're in this different headspace. Yeah, I think those kind of are the things I think about when we're returned to work. Actually, the last thing is this idea of accommodation. I've been playing around with and curious about how we're going to see leaders or managers or HR departments expand any accommodation policies or procedures to support folks who might be a bit anxious around a return to work through that graduated time frame. So I'm just,
yeah, so there's a lot to think about, right? And we've also been talking about, today I might feel fine, and tomorrow I might be anxious, and the next day I might be all right. And that change can happen based on whatever else is going on. But so what are you working on right now, Kerri? Where's your focus?
Yeah, so I've had I guess the two big pieces are really working with career coaching clients, so more on that one individual level, and working with them through their career and life transitions. And then the other piece, which is where I really love to play, is around designing workshops, bringing positive psychology, taking it off the shelf, as I've been instructed by some leaders, take it off the shelf and make it accessible for me. And so between Unpack Your Hero and then another program called the Are You Fracking with Your Flourishing, and really looking at that emotional composting idea of how can we take the messages from our negative emotions and turn them into that fertilizer for growth. And then working with inspired by so many clients on designing a journal around bringing us to this place of being versus knowers and doers. And so those are kind of the three projects that have been keeping me busy over the last several months.
Oh, very good. Tell us more about the difference between being versus knowing and doing.
Yeah. Well, I think that this knowledge economy, while it's beautiful and rich, and I'm curious and I have a love of learning, so I'm all about knowing. But what I feel like I've been observing and experience over the last several years is that it's pretty exhausting to be valued or to believe that your value comes from what you know and what you do. And I know that it's an important thing to know, have knowledge and to be contributing. But I find that the stressors can come from constantly having to know, or do in order to be valued. And that I think is a big stressor, and it's a mindset. Success has become, I've got a million emails and I'm constantly on the go, or I'm busy, right? And this is from that place of knowing or doing. When I shift into, well, how do I want to be today? I still get the knowing and the doing, but it's done from this energy or from this reserve that says, well, I'm being patient today, or I'm being loved today. So I get to experience my full expression and have my value come from that, or my self-identity, and I guess through that value, rather than from what I know or what I do. And I find the contributions I make from a place of being are richer and deeper than from just what I know or do. So I'm just really playing around with this concept. Yeah.
Well, and it lends itself so much to the concept of burnout, right? Because burnout comes from when we're always knowing or doing instead of having time to just be. And so it's great work and very timely right now for us to understand that. And it leads me back to something that you said. I mean, I'm an introvert by nature. You're an extrovert by nature. I found that I need to be around people. I can't be not around people. So I guess I hadn't thought of it, but I guess I found my inner extrovert by being isolated. And so tell me how you discovered that inner introvert. What does that mean? How did you experience it?
Okay. It's funny. I giggle even just thinking about it, but I think being a high energy and extrovert, constantly out meeting people, learning, that tends to be my outlet, or experiencing new things. When COVID hit and I couldn't be out in community, I got really fussed. Like for the first few weeks, I was like, my natural default soothing mechanisms or socializing mechanisms or even my well-being mechanisms were kind of taken away. And I had to get real. I was literally just listening to some music, and all of a sudden I was just like, well, just get comfortable in your own skin. Like get to know you, reconnect with who you are and maybe even who you're going to be. And so I tend to default to, so when I had this awareness that there is this inner introvert who can be, self-soothing as well as, on their own. I started to gravitate to activities that I remember liking as a young child. So puzzles was a fairly independent activity. And through that, then came, I don't know, quiet and stillness, which again, as an extrovert, quiet and stillness can be pretty uncomfortable. And so I started to notice that poetry, words were starting to reemerge, but from a different place. And so the poems are looking very different than they may have looked 5 years ago. And then that took me back to a place of, oh, wow, well, now there's these words. I then started to gravitate to this wonderful device called our cell phones, and I've been playing Wordle and Wordscapes. And so activities that I really enjoy, like I get a lot of enjoyment from, that are very independent, have been very soothing. And so I think what's happened over the 2 years is I've learned to integrate the two. So I feel much more balanced, and I feel more at ease with my extrovert, balanced by my introvert. And so there's this wisdom, maturity, I think, that's happened by integrating the introvert. She's made me more disciplined. I've always been persistent, but I feel like the shift has been, now I feel more disciplined and patient, if those make sense to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of the evolution of life, that we start off just giving into whatever our impulses are. We might refine that a bit, but then we just say, well, that's who I am. And then as we get more mature, then we say, I'm all things, and I can do all things, and I can find a way to have balance in the moment. Because I think work-life balance is a bit of an unattainable goal, and that what we want is balance in the moment. And that's by not being an extreme, or not being an always or a never, but being able to say, yeah, I can find a way to do this, like you did. And I imagine that most extroverts who had to deal with isolation had to come to some realization, had to cope in some way. We were joking earlier in the pandemic that, for introverts, it's like, it's no big deal, I'm fine. But for extroverts, that was a real self-realization that they hadn't had before. But I think now, speaking as an introvert, there is a point at which, okay, that's enough. Like, I need to get out there.
Yeah.
What do you think this will mean to your work and your career going forward? Because it is very much, Kerri, what I know about what you do, it is very much predicated on your extroversion and the way that you connect with people.
I feel like the adaptation that I've been experiencing is, so, well, once you get real with the facts, like, okay, I can't do things, or it's not likely that I'll be able to do things in the way that I'm used to, or would prefer, whatever that is. And I feel grateful that, so many smart people have built out these digital networks and these digital tools and these ways to try to make a virtual experience as real as possible. So I think aside from meeting my inner introvert, all of a sudden I was like, okay, well, what's available now to start to test out what I would do in an analog version, like an in-class or an in workshop experience, and how can I perhaps digitize it? And so that the love of learning, right, showed up, and I was like, oh, well, okay, maybe this would be a nice augment to that offline experience. And in some of them, I haven't found the direct one-to-one, but I think what for the work that I do is it's brought me to the love of learning and in the spaces where people are figuring out how to adapt to the virtual or hybrid community. And so that I think has been the biggest learning. So whether that's Zoom or some of these like online apps that you can use to bring interactivity into it. And then I think also just looking at other ways to create a digital experience. I find music, I'm a big music fan, so I've been trying to bring music into experiences more, or sounds. So again, we're not doing a lot of talking, but we can bring sounds and visuals. So that's been a big part of it. And then if I can just geek out on tech, there's some really cool things happening with augmented reality and virtual reality that I've been starting to play around with in terms of creating a true one-to-one experience, because I think I've found that that technology would allow for me to do that. So the
No,
short
that's
answer is,
great. So
yeah.
yeah, really looking at how we can take what we've experienced, how we can take what's learned. And they say, I think I read one scientist said that the advances we've made in the last 2 years have been like 30 years of advances, had we not had the experience that we did. So what do you see now, Kerri, as the evolution around workplaces in terms of we get back and we are setting up a new normal, we're dealing with people's anxiety, but what other benefits might there be based on what we've gained from this?
Hmm. I think there's a couple of things I saw early on in the pandemic with clients. If I think about, employees, definitely their awareness. Like my dogs are sorry.
Yeah.
Right there, the time that's been permitted to reflect and understand what is really important. I think a lot of people have taken this opportunity to get more clear. So I'm hoping that that translates into, we'll call it more meaningful conversations, large conversations as we had with your manager and with your employer, so that it becomes a two-way, call it career management experience, in whether that's at a personal development or a professional development level. So I think that we'll see happen as people come back to work as an opportunity. And then I feel like the other opportunity is to, and these are big, this is a bigger one, but this is looking at what if any cultural norms might need to shift or adapt as part of that meeting, right? And there will be some chaos, but it is where chaos shows up that we know the system has the greatest opportunity to change. And so coming back to managers and leaders, do we have the opportunity to ready them to hold that space for 15 seconds or 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months in order to set the right pace for what this change is going to look like?
It's so hard for some leaders to change a team culture, but we now have a window of opportunity to change every single team culture because you have to build it new anyways. And so the idea that we could build it in a way that is psychologically safe, we could build it in a way that is inclusive, we could build it in a way that is collaborative and cohesive. To me, I'm excited about the possibility that we can build it differently and better than we did before. So, Kerri, I like to ask everybody this question. If you were explaining psych health and safety to somebody who had no idea what it was, but you wanted them to get an image, a vision of what it feels like to be in a psychologically healthy and safe workplace, how would you describe it?
Well, I guess I default to what it would look like, what it would sound like, and what it might feel like. And I feel like a psychologically safe place looks like individuals who, it's not conflict, but can have tension and still be kind and compassionate with one another. I feel like feeling psychologically safe, looks like an individual feeling safe in self so that they can also be safe in community. Psychological safety for me sounds like people, again, sharing and expressing what's on their mind in ways that is, again, respectful, kind, and compassionate. And then what it feels like, I think if there's this calmness, there's this stillness about it, that there's this kind of I don't want to, cozy. For me, there's a coziness, so that I feel like I can kind of sit back in my chair a little bit and be okay to show my cards, whatever that, again, going back to expression. But those are kind of ways I feel like I know that I can then, can contribute, places where I can ask questions. But the definition or the way that I often will kind of characterize it is like, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like I can express myself? And do I feel like I can make a contribution to what's happening in the group, or what's happening in the department, or what's happening in the organization?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for that. So I'll give you the last word. Is there any other information that you think would be helpful for those who listen to the Psych Health and Safety podcast?
Oh, there's so many amazing things that are going on in this space, and I think that in terms of planting a seed for those is to hold the space for wonder, right? Be curious and be compassionate in your interactions with people, and ask a lot of questions before, right? Ask questions before making statements, and so I think those are two things that will serve us well as we try to recreate these communities as we come back together.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Kerri Brock. If people want to find you, how do they get in touch with you?
So if you wanted to reach out, you can find me on my LinkedIn, Kerri Brock. You'll notice me with squeeze a little positivity into every day. That's me, and I have So we'll leave it at LinkedIn. That's how the best way to get a hold of me.
Okay, and that's Kerri, Kerri, and Brock, Brock. And we will also post this podcast information on LinkedIn, Kerri, so you'll know when it's out there. And thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, Marianne, it was a pleasure to see you and to be part of this. I've listened to all the podcasts and excited to see the work you're doing.
Oh, thank you. I'm excited to do the work. I get to speak to people like you on a regular basis, so I'm always learning. Take care now.
You too. Thanks.